Everyone remembers the kiss at the altar. Fewer notice the glances on the sidelines. After the confetti settled, two best men stayed behind, sleeves rolled up, hearts unexpectedly open. In the soft, messy afterglow of love promised and vows sealed, they discovered the quiet beginning of their own. This is the story of how chores turned into conversations, how laughter turned to longing, and how, after one beautiful wedding, two friends learned to become each other's next great thing together. If this story warms your heart, subscribe, like, and share. Comment your favorite moment and invite someone special along today. I did not fall in love at the altar, or under the arch of flowers, or even during the last slow dance, when everyone swayed with their eyes closed, arms looped around someone they hoped wouldn't let go. I fell in love near a stack of folding chairs, my jacket off, tie stuffed into my pocket, hands smelling faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and the paper-thin roses that had been tucked into napkins. The music had ended. The bartender had disappeared into the night like a magic trick, and all that remained of the wedding were glasses that needed to be washed and glitter that had settled into the floorboards as if those boards had been saving space for it all along. He was there, sleeves rolled up, hair a little out of place in a way that made him look younger and softer than he had during his best man speech. James, with the careful eyes and the steady voice, the kind laugh that he never used for show, but let fall when it was honest right then. He was best man to Julian, and I was best man to Nate, two grooms who had danced like they didn't know where earth ended and sky began. I heard James before I saw him, the scrape of a chair leg, a gentle, careful there. And when I turned, he was balancing a stack of plates like a waiter who had missed his calling. "Do you think we should leave this for the staff?" he asked. But he didn't put his plates down, and I didn't put mine down either, and between the two of us it seemed the answer was, "No, we will not leave this for someone else." "We should at least get it started," I said. "It feels wrong to leave the room looking like it forgot how to breathe." He huffed a small laugh at that, and one corner of his mouth lifted. "I think of that expression now the way you think of a porch light. It doesn't demand attention, but you know you're walking the right path when you see it." Together, we moved without thinking too hard about the fact that everyone else had gone home to their beds and their routines and the way Monday morning always arrives too soon. Together we stacked and folded and wiped and packed and spoke between the work, one long, uncomplicated conversation that took its time, like a river taking a longer route on purpose. I'd first met James 3 months earlier at the florist, where the four of us were trying to decide between white peonies and blush roses. And all I remember from that meeting is thinking he was the kind of person who noticed if you had been quiet too long. He caught my eye when I drifted to the window and asked if I was bored or just overwhelmed by petals. I told him I was overwhelmed by decisions that carried the weight of other people's memories. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. "That's a lot to carry," he said, and it wasn't dramatic, just understanding. We fell into the habit of comparing notes after vendor meetings, and sometimes we swapped stories about our friends with the kind of affection that made you want to hug both grooms and never let go. In every interaction, he gave me the feeling of standing near a steady shore, even if a storm was far away and only imagined. On the wedding day, he kept his jokes low and his timing good, and when I stumbled over the opening of my speech, he tapped his glass with his ring and took a deliberate breath, and somehow that breath lent me mine. He spoke later about knowing Julian since college, about finding him asleep in a library with his cheek on a textbook, about the way home had felt like any space they shared together. I spoke about Nate, who once lent me his umbrella and then ran beside me in the rain because he had been worried about me arriving dry and alone. It was the kind of wedding where the vows were not perfect, but they were true, where someone's grandmother danced with her cane in the air, And the photographer cried, even while she kept snapping photos, and a child fell asleep on a pile of coats with confetti stuck to her fingers like stars. When it was all done, when even the grooms had been pulled into a car with tin cans bumping behind them, when the night had pressed its cool hand on the back of my neck and whispered, "You did it," that is when I found myself beside James too, aware of how quiet the room had become and how loud the stories in my head were. He lifted a chair, and I lifted another, and we formed a clumsy assembly line that was a little silly and a lot comforting. He told me that he liked this part, the end of big things, because it gave him a moment to breathe and notice. I told him that I always felt an ache at the end of joyful days, as if the joy had been a tide rolling away from me, no matter how much I knew it would return. "You could come with me to the diner around the corner," he said, after we had wrapped the last centerpiece in tissue paper. "They have pancakes at midnight, and pancakes at midnight fix a lot of aches." It was an invitation spoken simply, as if he held a door and waited to see if I would walk through. I said yes because I wanted to keep talking, and also because it had been a day of saying yes. Yes to being there for my friend when he cried in the dressing room. Yes to holding someone's baby during the group photos. Yes to the chance that the night still had something to give. At the diner, the lights were bright enough to make the chrome around the counter wink at us. We slid into a booth with cracked red vinyl, and the server brought coffee the color of possibility. We laughed about the flower girl who had taken her, jobbed too seriously and sprinkled petals into people's shoes. We compared charcuterie plates like we were discussing history. We stared at the menu too long because we had both eaten at the reception and still somehow felt empty. In that way the heart sometimes feels even when the stomach is full. "Do you know," James said, "that the first diner I fell in love with had a jukebox that played only sad songs? I was 13 and I ordered grilled cheese, and my father told me that if you could sit in a place and not wish to be anywhere else, that was a good place." "Do you feel that way here?" I asked. And it was risky, but not too risky. The way setting down a glass on a counter is risky because it might clink, or it might thud, or it might just land without a sound at all. He thought about it long enough that I worried I'd made it awkward. Then he smiled down at the laminated menu and said, "Yes, I think I do." We kept our eyes on the pancakes when they arrived, generous and golden, with butter that made its own small rivers. We ate and talked about work, my job in the library, where I spent my days listening to the way people tell questions, the way they sometimes apologize for not knowing, and I told them there was no apology necessary in curiosity. He spoke of his clinic, where he worked as a physical therapist, coaxing stubborn muscles to remember their courage. He told me he had a habit of cheering too loudly when someone took a step they'd feared for months, and how one patient told him that his applause sounded like he had brought a whole stadium with him. "I'd like beginnings," he confessed. "They are shaky, they can be slow, but they are honest. You cannot fake your first step." We did not put any name to what we were doing. We simply sat there until the coffee cooled and the server turned. The sign on the door to closed and winked at us, as if we were teenagers brave enough to stay out past curfew. Outside, the night air held us gently. He called a car for me because I had left mine at home, and when it arrived, he put a hand on the door and said, "I'll text you tomorrow if that's all right." And I nodded in a way that probably said more than a nod usually does. Tomorrow came and he did text. A photo of the confetti still stuck to his shoe, a joke about how even his shoes were sentimental. I sent a picture of the boutonniere dried and delicate on my windowsill, and we made fun of ourselves, and then we made plans. Coffee became a walk along the river, which became a museum visit where we didn't keep our voices low enough, and the guard shushed us with a smile he failed to hide. We stood too long in front of a painting of a woman with a letter in her hand, and he asked what I thought it said, And I told him maybe it said, "I believe you, because that is what is hardest to write and most necessary to read." We learned small, tender things. His mother collected salt shakers shaped like animals, and as a child, he'd invented elaborate backstories for them. My grandfather used to hum when he made soup, and I could still hear the notes if I closed my eyes while onions hissed in a pan. He slept on the left side of the bed because he liked to have the window near him. I slept on the side closest to the door because I liked the feeling of arrival. He saved paper maps from trips and folded them badly on purpose, so the places he liked best were the creases he could find by touch. I kept a drawer of index cards with lines from novels that made me feel less alone. We were careful at first. He would brush a crumb from my sleeve and then apologize, and I would step back from the curb without touching him, even when the bus rushed by too fast. It felt sacred, that carefulness. It felt like being trusted with a teacup someone loved, the kind you hold with two hands and don't set down until the host tells you where it goes. One afternoon, standing under an awning as rain stitched lines down the street, he reached up and smoothed a drop of water from my eyebrow with his thumb, and neither of us apologized. "You have rain," he said, as if I had grown it. I thought, there are moments in life where you could say something that would change your tomorrow entirely, and this was one. I did not tell him I was afraid, but I was intensely, in the way you are when the world has offered you a gift and you're afraid you might drop it or leave it somewhere by mistake. Past versions of me had taught me to be quiet about my heart. Love had arrived before wearing clothes that did not fit once I tried to move in them. Love had spoken loudly and then wandered off without leaving a note on the kitchen table. But James did not mind my slow. He did not ask for what I could not give yet. He just sat with me in the places between errands. And he laughed at my jokes when I expected them to fall flat. And he remembered which corner of my mouth lifts when I'm about to say something I wish I didn't have to say. We kissed for the first time at a bus stop because it felt audacious in the best way, holding a thing so private while the city moved around us. I was about to ask if he wanted to come with me to the bookstore because a new shipment of poetry had arrived, and he said yes before I finished the sentence. And then he leaned in and set his lips on mine like he was leaving a note there. It was brief, and it was soft, and the bus roared past without stopping, and someone across the street whistled for a cab, and the world did not change, and also it did. We did not spring forward like a clock set wrong. We wound ourselves toward something steady. He met my sister for coffee and asked her about her garden. He took my hand under the table and squeezed when she told us about the rose bush that had stubbornly bloomed after a hard winter. I met his father after a routine checkup left him weary, and we sat on the couch together, watching a baseball game he barely followed. He asked me if I liked the announcer's voice, and I said I liked voices that sounded like home, and he patted my knee twice, the way people do when words don't want to be clumsy. There were, of course, small stumbles. The night I realized we had become important to each other, I goaded him into a conversation he wasn't ready for. I asked what we were, and the word we hung in the room like a balloon, neither of us knew how to pop gently. He looked down at his hands and said, "I want to get this right." And it hit me in a place I can still locate, that he was not hesitating because he did not care. He was hesitating because caring had taught him to be careful. We agreed to let the word arrive when the shape of it fit. And to my surprise, it came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday, which seems too ordinary, except that ordinary days are often the kind that alter your memory's furniture. We were walking back from the grocery store with too many apples and a bouquet of eucalyptus that made the whole bag smell like a spa. A delivery truck backed onto the street, and the driver called out an apology, and we stepped around it, our steps in rhythm the way they are when you've learned someone's pace. "You're my boyfriend," he said, like he was choosing surety on purpose. He did not stop walking, and he did not look at me as if checking a script. He just said it as we crossed the street, as if it had always been true, and he had finally read the label. The word eased into the space between us like it had been trying to get home. Boyfriend. There are people who think it is an adolescent word, too light for adult lives, but I loved it immediately. It felt like rolling up your sleeves and showing up for the everyday. It felt like the kind of promise you can keep on a Tuesday after the grocery store, without needing a brass band or fireworks or a witness. I said it back, of course I did. I said it twice, the way you say something to yourself in a mirror, not because you doubt it, but because the sound holds a new kind of dignity. Being boyfriends did not change the way we walked down the street or how we did the dishes, but it changed the temperature behind my ribs. It made the days feel more comprehensible. We discovered the relief of small rituals. On Wednesdays, he took a late lunch so he could meet me at the library for 20 minutes, just long enough to sit in the corner near the large window and tell me something funny that had happened to him at work. I brought him a chocolate croissant one week and a banana the next. He switched the banana into my tote bag when I wasn't looking, and when I found it later with a note that said, "For bravery," I laughed out loud in a room that prefers quiet. On Sundays we cooked something slow, beans that softened through the afternoon, or stew that grew tender if we let it, and told each other about the stories we had read that week that had made us kinder. We were not perfect. Nobody is, though everyone tries for a while to act as if they are. He had a tendency to go silent when he was worried he had disappointed someone, and I had a tendency to over-explain when I thought I had not been understood. Once he cancelled dinner because a patient had needed him late, and he sent one line of text when he meant to send 5. I misread the silence and thought it was a shift away. By the time he arrived at my door with takeout that had gone cold, I had worked myself into the kind of tight knot that makes it difficult to be rational. We did not handle it gracefully. We spoke too quickly, and then we both went quiet. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed thinking, this is what it means to learn another person for real. He put the takeout on the dresser. He sat on the floor and leaned his head against my knee and said, in a voice that is still a landmark in my heart, "Sometimes I do the bare minimum when I think I'm already failing. I hate that about myself, and I am trying to change it." Then he looked up at me. "May I try again with you?" I'd been ready to hold my breath for an argument, and instead I took the deepest breath I had taken all week. "Yes," I said, "I can also try again." But I didn't tell him he shouldn't be that way, or offer a solution I wasn't asked for. I only slid down to the floor and sat next to him and let our shoulders touch. We opened the takeout and ate with our fingers, because the forks seemed too formal for the moment. We sat there long enough that the knot I had tied myself in loosened. We found a way to say, "I'm scared," without making it the other person's job to eliminate fear forever. I think of that night as the one where we learned the choreography of coming back to each other. We visited Nate and Julian in their new apartment just after they returned from their honeymoon, and the four of us watched a home video of the wedding shot by a cousin whose hands were rarely steady and whose mood was always celebratory. Julian cried watching himself cry. Nate laughed and grabbed his hand. When we appeared on the screen together, James steadying my elbow as I fumbled with the microphone, me handing him a glass of water during his speech, we looked at each other on the couch and then back at our past selves. "We didn't know," I whispered. He whispered back, "Maybe we did." And we left it there, a soft memory with a gentle conclusion. The first time we danced together was not at a party. It was in my kitchen on a Thursday night. The radio played a song I had grown up hearing through the thin walls of my childhood home, and he tilted his head at me as if asking a question. And I said, "Yes," and held out my hands. We were terrible, which is its own pleasure. We bumped into the table and giggled. He dipped me once and nearly dropped me, and then we held on a little tighter and swayed in a circle small enough to fit inside our arms. I rested my cheek against his shoulder and counted his breaths. If you had walked by the window, you might not have noticed anything there. But for me, it was another small vow made without paper or witnesses. Time passed, because it always does, no matter how you beg it to slow. We built pieces of a life together in ways that did not need to be announced. He learned to love my quiet mornings, and I learned to love his way of telling me 3 versions of a story, because he wanted to make sure I got all its colors. My mother asked if he would come to Thanksgiving, and he brought pies warm enough to make her eyes go soft. His sister had a baby, and when he held his niece, he held her like she was the first delicate thing anyone had entrusted to him, which of course she was not. But it felt like it in that moment. We returned to the wedding hall a year later for Nate and Julian's anniversary party. Small, casual, just a toast among friends and a cake with frosting that looked like waves. Walking into the room felt like stepping into a memory that had grown gentle with time. The chairs were straight, without any confetti hiding beneath them. The windows reflected the late afternoon, and the floor no longer remembered our feet. But I remembered. My hand found James's and rested there without needing permission. We stood for a moment in the doorway, and I thanked the space for giving me the kind of evening that quietly changes your life. The grooms greeted us with the kind of joy that makes you forget you were ever nervous to attend anything. "You too," Julian said, playfully pointing between us, a smile spreading across his face as if he had been waiting to see it. "We had a bet," Nate added. I said 6 months. He said 3. We both lost. Lost what? James asked, pretending not to know. Lost our breath, Nate said, and pulled us into a hug that smelled like cologne and vanilla cake. "Now tell us everything. We told them enough." We told them about the diner and the pancakes, about the first kiss and the bus we let pass. We told them about the Tuesday when boyfriend became a word between us that did not pinch or slide. We did not tell them about the night on the floor with cold takeout, because some things you keep in your pocket, like a stone you rub with your thumb. A secret that is not a secret so much as a shelter. At one point, a song from the wedding playlist came on, a slow and bright waltz that had made someone's uncle tear up, and we found ourselves back on that dance floor. James looked at me with the kind of light in his eyes that you could mistake for reflection if you didn't know better. But I knew better. He put his hand on my shoulder, and I put mine on his waist, and we orbited each other gently. My heart did not pound. It settled. We fit into the music, and into the quiet of shared history. "You know," he said somewhere between the chorus and the bridge, "I'm still grateful we stayed to clean." "I am too," I said. "I think it taught me that love sometimes begins where everyone else has already gone home." He nodded. "And that it helps to have extra garbage bags in the trunk." We laughed because it was true. We had more cake than we needed, and we wrapped a slice in foil to take to the diner where it all began. The server recognized us and pretended to be annoyed that we were bringing our own dessert, then took a fork and joined us and declared it too sweet in a way that meant just right. James drew a map on a napkin of the last year, a line for each moment that had mattered, a crooked route that made sense only to us. When he reached the bottom of the napkin, he drew a small heart, not as a flourish, but as a reminder. On the way home, we cut through the park and found the bench where we had once sat crowded together, as if the bench could hold more if we made ourselves smaller. A streetlight flickered. Somewhere a dog barked and then reconsidered. My hand traced the seam of his jacket. "Do you ever think about the fact that we were both best men before we were boyfriends?" I asked. "Like we had to practice showing up for someone else before we could show up for each other." "I do," he said. "I think being a best man is the rehearsal dinner for becoming a good partner. You make lists, you check in, you carry things, you admit when you messed up and fix it. You root for the happiness of someone you love without making it about yourself." He turned to look at me. "And then one day you turn around and there you are. Not a practice, but life." It was late, and the air had the kind of crispness that asks you to pull your coat tighter. He tucked his chin into my shoulder, and we sat quietly for a while, listening to the small sounds that told us the city was still awake. I felt the comfort of being beside him, which is its own kind of prayer. The future did not appear to us all at once. It never does. But the next day rose up in my mind and showed itself. Breakfast, a grocery list, a phone call on my lunch break, a plan to stop by his sister's to drop off a book. The promise of a movie later, where we would argue gently about whether the ending was hopeful or just clever. I thought about how love is made of these thousands of ordinary promises, kept and kept again, until they become a path you can follow even in the dark. We walked home, holding the same slice of leftover cake like it was a trophy. When we got to my door, he stepped aside and said, "You first." And I did, and he followed. And there were shoes under the bench, and a key bowl that always had at least one paperclip in it. And the eucalyptus in the vase had dried into something crisper and somehow more fragrant. We put the cake into the refrigerator and set our phones face down and leaned into the quiet. He took my hand and led me to the couch, and we sat with our knees touching. And I felt, as I have felt many times since, that home is made out of a person long before it is made out of a place. Once, months later, I told him that if our story were a recipe card, I would write "Start with generosity" at the top. And he would add "Stir in steadiness," and I would write "Season with laughter," and he would add "Simmer with patience." There would be a footnote in small print that said, "If it tastes too sweet, add a pinch of salt. If it tastes too salty, add a little honey. Don't be precious. Eat while warm. Share with neighbors." We never went back to being the men we were before that wedding, in the way we could have, as if nothing had begun. And thank goodness for that. We learned how to be good to each other, without an audience, without applause, without the acid tingle of feeling we had to prove it to anyone. We learned how to face things that seemed daunting by standing shoulder to shoulder and asking for help if we needed it. We learned how to tidy up after mistakes and stand up when the floor felt unsteady, and laugh when laughter was the only way to keep from becoming too serious for our own good. Sometimes people ask me when I knew, as if there is a single moment that lights up in the museum of your mind and has a plaque underneath it. But love, at least ours, was a series of small rooms we kept choosing to enter. The doorways were ordinary, and sometimes we bumped our shoulders as we passed. But we kept going, hand in hand, and every room had a window wide enough to let in air, and a view where, if you leaned in and squinted just right, you could see the next door and the next, and the next. I think about that last night at the wedding hall more often than makes sense. I think about the way the confetti stuck to my shoes, and how his hands smelled of citrus from the cleaner. I think about us, best men standing in the quiet after, taking stock of a room that had been filled with love and was now only tables and chairs. We didn't know, or maybe we did. Either way, we stayed. We carried. We made the undone done. We laughed in the echo of other people's vows. We walked out into the night together, hungry for pancakes and something we did not yet know how to name. And in the end, that is how we went from best men to boyfriends. By choosing to be there after the music faded, by trusting the ordinary moments to grow into something that lasts, by saying yes to the gentle work of making a life side by side.